Welcome everyone again to my channel. 50 years ago, from December 7th to 16, 1972, the Apollo 17 mission took place, the last American moon landing. In this regard, I decided to return to the topic of U.S. space programs, and today I present to the audience a highly circumstantial piece of evidence, namely, the life stories of the astronauts. Many proponents of the moon hoax theory, which I am now counted among, cite rather interesting statistics on the deaths of Apollo program participants. Specifically, over the 2 years of 1966-67, about 11 people reportedly died from unnatural causes according to various sources. NASA supporters, on the other hand, counter that many proponents of the moon landing conspiracy include in these statistics people who had no relation to the Apollo program, i.e., those who did not fly on Apollo missions and were not even enlisted in the program. Therefore, such statistics are incorrect. To avoid being accused of such incorrect statistics, I decided to go through the lives of all the astronauts who participated in the U.S. space programs, Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo. Moreover, for me, all three programs seem equally like space opera, and most likely falsified. At least, this is what I believe today, based on the information available. So, let's begin. American astronaut number 1, Alan Shepard, made the first suborbital flight on the Mercury Redstone 3 spacecraft. Later, he was diagnosed with Meniere's disease, an inner ear disorder that can cause serious complications for the vestibular system. He was grounded from flying, but later underwent a successful surgery, flew on Apollo 14, and walked on the moon at the age of 47. American astronaut number 2, who also made a suborbital flight, Virgil Grissom, flew on the Mercury Redstone 4 spacecraft, which was called Liberty Bell 7. Later, along with John Young, he flew on the Gemini 3 spacecraft, which was the first manned mission of the Project Gemini. The astronauts splashed down 80 kilometers off target, and during the half-hour wait for recovery, they experienced seasickness. In my opinion, this is quite an interesting detail for people selected for the astronaut corps. After this, Grissom became a vigorous critic of the Apollo program and shouted his opinion on the unreliability of the Apollo spacecraft and the Saturn launch vehicle from the rooftops. He believed that it was problematic to fly into space in such tin cans, let alone reach the moon. On January 27, 1967, under strange circumstances, he perished along with Edward White and Roger Chaffee in the Apollo 1 capsule fire. The first American astronaut to orbit the Earth was John Glenn, a participant in World War II and the Korean War, with over 9,000 hours of flying time. He flew on the Mercury Atlas 6 and left NASA as early as 1964, even before the Gemini and Apollo programs began. Seeing no prospects for himself, he went into private business until 1974, and later, from 1974 to 1999, he was a senator. As a senator, in 1998, at the age of 78, he flew on the shuttle Discovery, that is, his health allowed it. Scott Carpenter flew on the Mercury Atlas 7, and his spacecraft was called Aurora 7. During the mission, he got a bout of euphoria, which led to fuel overconsumption, and he was subsequently grounded from further flights. He participated in the development of the Apollo lunar modules for some time but ultimately left NASA in 1967 and became an aquanaut. Later, he worked with Jacques-Yves Cousteau and remains the only person to have been both an astronaut and an aquanaut. Walter Schirra flew on the Mercury Atlas 8. His spacecraft was called Sigma 7. He later flew on Gemini 6 and Apollo 7, the first manned Apollo spacecraft. He left NASA in 1969, having decided to do so before the Apollo 7 mission. He was involved in leasing, building pipelines in Alaska, and writing books. Gordon Cooper flew on the Mercury Atlas 9. His spacecraft was called Faith 7. He later flew on Gemini 5 and was a backup crew member for Apollo 10 and Apollo 13. He left NASA in 1970, went into business, and was a firm believer in UFOs. John Young flew on Gemini 3, Gemini 10, Apollo 10, Apollo 16, and commanded the first space shuttle. He became the first person to make a fifth and sixth spaceflight and piloted 4 types of spacecraft. This record is likely to remain unbroken, as generations of spacecraft are not changing as frequently now. He served at NASA for 42 years, which is also a record to date, and had over 15,000 flight hours on various aircraft. James McDivitt flew on Gemini 4 and Apollo 9 and managed the Apollo program from 1969 to June 1972. He left in June 1972 and, for some reason, did not manage the last Apollo 17 mission. Later, he worked in a power-producing company and the Pullman Company. Edward White flew on Gemini 4, becoming the first American to walk in space, and perished along with Grissom in the Apollo 1 capsule fire. To better understand who perished in this capsule, let's try to draw a parallel with our cosmonautics. It would be like if we had lost German Titov and Alexei Leonov in one spacecraft, our second cosmonaut and the first cosmonaut to walk in outer space. Charles Conrad flew on Gemini 5, Gemini 11, Apollo 12, and the Skylab space station. He died in 1999 in a motorcycle accident. Frank Borman flew on Gemini 7 and Apollo 8. During the Apollo 8 mission, he threw up twice and experienced a bout of what is called space sickness or the sixth orbit syndrome. At this time, the vestibular system adapts to work in zero gravity, and many astronauts experience some deterioration in their well-being. A similar thing happened to our German Titov on the sixth orbit. He also threw up. But what's interesting is NASA's explanation of what happened. It turns out that Frank Borman's bout of space sickness arose, attention, because of the spacious Apollo cabin. In the Gemini flights, nothing like this happened since the Gemini cabin was apparently more cramped, and a person couldn't float freely in zero gravity. By the way, Frank Borman, along with Jim Lovell, was a participant in the 14-day Gemini mission, and nothing like this happened to him. Apollo 8 splashed down at night. They had to wait for rescuers until morning, and during this wait, Frank Borman also experienced a bout of seasickness, meaning he threw up again. Such a pilot was somehow selected for the American Astronaut Corps. He left in 1970, but he decided to leave even before the Apollo 8 mission. And moreover, he openly stated that he did not intend to be the first person to set foot on the moon, or to go to the moon at all. His goal was simply to beat the Russians in the moon race, knock them flat on their butt, and consider his space mission accomplished. Incidentally, shortly before the Apollo 11 mission in 1969, Borman visited the Soviet Union, Star City, and presented a watch that had been with him in space. This was part of a U.S. propaganda campaign that presumably aimed to psychologically crush the Russians, showing us how far ahead they were in space. So, after leaving NASA in 1970, he first managed an airline that quickly went bankrupt, and later he became a farmer and raised cows. Jim Lovell flew on Gemini 7, Gemini 12, Apollo 8, and the ill-fated Apollo 13. He left NASA in 1973 and worked in a towing company. Tom Stafford flew on Gemini 6, Gemini 9, Apollo 10, and participated in the Apollo-Soyuz test project. In 1975, he became the head of the Air Force Flight Test Center. Neil Armstrong flew on Gemini 8. The flight was not very successful. It lasted only 10 hours, and the mission was almost entirely disrupted. Despite such minimal experience gained, Neil Armstrong was the commander of Apollo 11 and the first human to set foot on the moon. He left NASA in 1971 and taught aeronautics at the University of Cincinnati. David Scott flew on Gemini 8, Apollo 9, Apollo 15, and like the entire Apollo 15 crew, was involved in a shady story with postal covers. They took about 300 covers on board, which they planned to sell later in agreement with a German philatelist. Each was supposed to get about $7,000. However, since this was done secretly from NASA management, which found out about it, they were immediately grounded from further flights and had legal battles for a long time. Some of the covers were returned to NASA to be sold for charitable purposes. After some time, they reportedly got some covers back through a lawsuit. Overall, it's a murky story. In any case, they were all barred from further flights. Later, David Scott co-authored a book with Alexei Leonov. He engaged in private business related to space shuttles and later sold the watch he wore in space for $1.6 million. Eugene Cernan flew on Gemini 9, Apollo 10, Apollo 17, and became the last person to set foot on the moon. He wrote a book with the same title, The Last Man on the Moon, and left NASA in 1976 for private business. Richard Gordon flew on Gemini 11 and Apollo 12, worked on space shuttle design, but left NASA in 1972. He was vice president of a professional football club and a manager of oil companies. Michael Collins flew on Apollo 11, the first spacecraft to land on the moon. Until 1962, he was a heavy smoker. He quit smoking the same year after a terrible hangover. Apparently, besides smokers and alcoholics, there were no better candidates for the American Astronaut Corps. Initially, he was supposed to fly on Apollo 8, but he was diagnosed with a cervical hernia. Nevertheless, he quickly underwent a successful operation and, skipping the Apollo 8 mission, he was sent on Apollo 11, where he was the command module pilot that remained in lunar orbit and waited for Armstrong and Aldrin to return from the moon. He announced his departure even before the Apollo 11 flight, stating that if the mission was successful, he would end his space career. He left NASA in 1970 for the State Department and served as the director of the National Air and Space Museum until 1978. Edwin Buzz Aldrin flew on Gemini 12 and Apollo 11, becoming the second person to walk on the moon. He served in the Korean War. After his first flight on Gemini 12, he fell into a severe depression, which his wife said she had never seen him in before. He believed his depression to be hereditary, as both his grandfather and mother committed suicide due to depression. Nevertheless, a person with such a psychological background still found himself in the American Astronaut Corps. He left NASA in 1971. He briefly participated in the design of space shuttles but left as he saw no prospects for himself. He's still alive but has periodically been treated for alcoholism and depression for most of his life since the moon landing. Don Isley was supposed to fly on Apollo 1, but during training, he dislocated his shoulder twice and needed urgent surgery,
so he flew on Apollo 7, the first manned Apollo spacecraft instead. At the time of preparing for the mission, he also had an extramarital affair with a woman who would later become his second wife. However, he was merely scolded and told to fix the situation, but he still went to space.
He left NASA in 1970 to become the Peace Corps country director. He died of a heart attack at the age of 57. Walter Cunningham also flew on Apollo 7. He previously served in the Korean War and earned a Master of Arts degree. On Apollo 7, he was the lunar module pilot, even though the lunar module was not even docked to Apollo 7. So, the purpose of his flight was not entirely clear, as he gained no significant experience from it. He left NASA in 1971 for private business. Bill Anders was also the lunar module pilot, though there was no lunar module on Apollo 8.
This was the first spacecraft to orbit the Moon. He left NASA in 1969, not waiting for anything.
He worked for various companies and served as the ambassador to Norway. Russell Schweickart flew on Apollo 9.
He also threw up due to space sickness and was grounded from further flights.
He left NASA in 1977 and became a California governor's assistant. Alan Bean flew on Apollo 12 and the Skylab space station. He left in 1981 to become an artist.
Jack Swigert flew on the ill-fated Apollo 13 and is the author of the famous phrase, "Houston, we have a problem."
He was involved in the postal cover scandal with the Apollo 15 crew.
He left NASA in 1977.
Fred Haise was the lunar module pilot on the ill-fated Apollo 13, and during this mission, he developed a kidney and urinary tract infection.
He piloted the shuttle Enterprise in the approach and landing tests but did not wait for its spaceflight and returned to being a fighter pilot in 1979.
Stuart Roosa flew on Apollo 14 and left NASA in 1976.
Edgar Mitchell also flew on Apollo 14, left NASA in 1972, and was involved in promoting ecologically pure products, paranormal phenomena, and attempted to sell the camera he used on the Moon.
In 1961, flying on a training mission, James Irwin sustained serious injuries, complex fractures, amnesia, and was on the verge of having his leg amputated. Pre-flight tests revealed he had a tendency for cardiac arrhythmia. However, this did not prevent him from flying on Apollo 15. He had a heart attack on the Moon, but in Houston, they were relatively calm, saying he was in better conditions than he would be in an intensive care unit on Earth, as he was breathing pure oxygen in reduced gravity in the lunar module. He returned to Earth safely, left NASA in 1972, became very devout, founded the High Flight Foundation, and died of a heart attack at 61. Al Worden flew on Apollo 15 as the command module pilot and left NASA in 1975. Like the entire Apollo 15 crew, he was involved in the murky story of the postal covers.
Ken Mattingly flew on Apollo 16, later flew on space shuttles, and left NASA in 1985.
Charles Duke flew on Apollo 16, had slight astigmatism and motion sickness, but this did not prevent him from becoming both a fighter pilot and an astronaut. In January 1972, he contracted severe bilateral pneumonia. However, after hastily conducted treatment, he went on the Apollo 16 mission in April. He retired from NASA as a brigadier general in 1976, later became a beer distributor, and the president of Orbit Corporation.
Harrison Schmitt was the only civilian pilot in the Apollo program. He was a geologist and was sent on the last mission, Apollo 17, to carry out at least some serious scientific work during all the Apollo missions.
He left NASA in 1975, ran for the Senate, and was a strong opponent of the global warming theory. Ron Evans also flew on Apollo 17 as the command module pilot, which remained in lunar orbit. He left NASA in 1977 to become a coal industry executive.
Interestingly, while putting on his spacesuit before boarding Apollo 17, he quickly smoked his last cigarette. I can't recall any Soviet cosmonauts who hastily smoked their last cigarette before boarding a spacecraft, but for NASA astronauts, it seemed normal. Smokers, alcoholics, depressives. Incidentally, he died at 56 from a heart attack. Among those who did not fly but were involved in these programs, pilots Elliot C. and Charlie Bassett died on February 28, 1966, in a training flight on the ultra-reliable and well-tested T-38 aircraft. They were assigned to the Gemini 9 crew and crashed the aircraft into the very hangar where their Gemini 9 spacecraft was located. Such a strange coincidence.
Clifton Williams died in the same type of T-38 ultra-reliable training aircraft in October 1967.
He was initially assigned as a backup for the Apollo 10 crew and then was assigned to the main crew of Apollo 12. Interestingly, after both accidents, no serious investigations were conducted. Flights on the T-38 continued, and this ultra-reliable aircraft either still remains in the training units of the U.S. or stayed there for about 50 years. These few accidents did not affect its reputation at all. Finally, Edward Givens, the backup for the Apollo 7 crew, died in a car accident in June 1967. Thus, out of the 38 astronauts who participated in the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs, 7 died under rather strange circumstances within 2 years, 1966 and 1967. This suggests that at that time, there was a selection process, so to speak, for loyal astronauts, eliminating some dissidents.
3 people later died of heart attacks at the ages of 56 to 60, indicating relatively soft health criteria for selecting astronauts.
But the most interesting fact is that out of the remaining 31 astronauts, 15 left NASA before 1972, even before the end of the Apollo program. They saw no prospects for themselves in either moon missions or spaceflights in general. What kind of so-called enthusiasts of their work were they? After flying once into space, they immediately ended their space careers.
Moreover, many of them assured that they would end their careers even before they made that single flight.
How did they get into the astronaut corps? What drew them there? Our people wait for years, sometimes decades, for their chance to fly into space.
Even if they do not manage to fly, they still remain connected to space in some way, participating in the design of spacecraft or engaging in some research programs. But these guys left for private business and so on.
Again, in 1972, many who left NASA were not even 40 years old.
So, they could have waited for the space shuttle missions.
As we can see, health and health requirements allowed this. But apparently, they knew something about the U.S. space programs and did not expect that the Americans would succeed with the space shuttles, especially in the near future.
Let's look at this interesting photograph. This is the Apollo 11 crew, Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins. It's a press conference, but not about the death of their comrade or any other tragic occasion. It's a press conference about their moon mission. People landed on another planet for the first time.
Not just people, but these three.
What's with their faces?
Where are the smiles?
Where is the joy from the greatest event in human history? They sit, mumble, and answer journalists' questions very briefly and awkwardly.
Where are the overwhelming emotions?
Where are the enthusiastic stories about how it happened? In my opinion, a very strange story. Regarding the health requirements, I've mentioned this several times already. The selection was quite strange.
Alcoholics, smokers, depressive individuals, people with surgeries that were relatively recent, not in the distant past. Again, I assume that the size of the U.S. Air Force was probably equal to or likely exceeded that of the Soviet Air Force.
Were there no worthy candidates in terms of health to join the astronaut corps?
There is another nuance. About half of the astronauts I mentioned were acquainted with each other even before they joined the astronaut corps.
I haven't heard of this in relation to Soviet cosmonauts.
As far as I know, if I'm wrong, correct me in the comments, they all got to know each other only after being enlisted in the corps. However, many of the NASA astronauts were roommates in dormitories, studied together, or served together in military units, and had superior subordinate relationships, and so on.
This is, of course, a very indirect argument, but it still allows us to suggest the following. If flying was not required and the selection was not based on health, then other qualities were needed. Loyalty, the ability to lie or, conversely, to remain silent when necessary.
Consequently, if someone like John Young was enlisted in the astronaut corps, he probably couldn't avoid being asked during interviews and psychological tests, "Whom can you recommend as being as reliable as you are?"
Which of your acquaintances can we also rely on? And this hypothetical John Young could very well have recommended his former colleagues, Aldrin or Cernan.
This is roughly how half of the astronauts might have been selected for the Gemini and Apollo programs.
That's an interesting statistic and an interesting story.
That's all for today.
See you next time.